Um, so thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here today. We are here at the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program's winter webinar number 3, Building Resilience Through Partnerships. I'm going to be your host today. My name is Andrew Smith. My pronouns are he and his. My co-host is...
Hello, I'm Carrie Ann Petrick, the Regional Coordinator for the Berkshires and Hilltowns. My pronouns are they, them.
And I forgot to say, I am the Regional Coordinator for the Greater Connecticut River Valley. So, which is kind of relevant, as you see in this slide. A lot of you will probably have a good guess of what that is. So if you know what that is, or you think you know what that is, put it in the chat box. I can't guarantee that there will be any prizes for correct answers, but you guys have all probably seen this before. Put on your thinking caps and start thinking about our regional solutions, because I just wanted to highlight that this is a regional event that a lot of us have experienced. So next slide. Right, so I want to welcome everybody here. I want to highlight a few things. We are recording today, so keep that in mind. We have some enhanced security protocols in place. One of those happens to be that we're going to lock the meeting around 1:15-ish, so if you have to jump out or anything like that, just please make sure you give us a message so we can figure out how to let you back in. A lot of you have been here for the past few weeks. This is our third webinar, Building Resilience Through Partnerships. Webinars 1 and 2 are up on our EEA's YouTube page, which you can just find at Mass EEA. Webinar 1 is only partially complete. We're going to have the second part of that on February 16th, 2021, which you can still sign up for. And we can drop the link in the chat if people want to see that. And obviously you have a beautiful overview of the Boston area, taken from the ISS space station about 20 years ago. So just a big, beautiful regional view. Let's go to the next slide. So we're here today to talk about regional projects and MVP program. On this screen, you can see some of the history of regional projects within the program. Back FY18, we had 2 regional projects for about $360,000. Those were in the Northeast and the Central region. And then you fast forward to FY21, we had 9 projects around the Commonwealth that are regional projects, $2.2 million worth of funding in that regard. Which, so the pattern is that around the Commonwealth, we're seeing more regional projects. The program is funding a greater number of regional projects. And it looks like every single region, except for my own region, has had regional projects. So Greater Connecticut River Valley, we're going to have to pull some regional projects together to sort of represent to the rest of the state. But what you can see is that it's becoming more and more of a focus of the program, and it's a benefit because there's lots of co-benefits to regional projects. That's what we're learning about today. So next slide. So we're here. A lot of you probably have heard this if you've been on the webinars. If this is your first webinar so far, we had our project team, some of our colleagues had a survey this past fall where they asked people what they wanted to hear and what they wanted to learn more about. Nature-based solutions, that's in the sort of the blue and the purple box. Those were the kind of #1 topics that people wanted to learn the most about. So we had that webinar. Last week we had EJ and community engagement. That was the second topic. And then the third topic is collaborations and partnerships, which is why we're here today. So if you could fast forward through those, next slide. So nature-based solutions, complete. EJ and community engagement, complete. And off we go. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kara, and she's going to give you some updates on what's going on in our program this spring.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So yeah, I wanted to give a few updates. I'm Kara Runston. I'm the MVP program manager, and I use she, her pronouns. Some quick things. One is that we have a new and improved MVP website, which is resilientma.org/MVP. And this should be really the first place that you go to find out all things about MVP. The homepage has info on our planning and action grants, links to some new toolkits that were developed, on topics of interest, including things like nature-based solutions and community engagement and environmental justice. So definitely check those out. The first time you go to this new web page, you might need to refresh. It might load the older page. So just make sure that you're seeing the banner that's on this slide when you look at the web page. Next slide. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the expression of interest prior to the FY22 funding round. That round is expected to open at the end of March or early April. And we heard on the survey that Andrew mentioned from the fall that people were really interested in this kind of opportunity. It basically makes more systematic what we've done in previous rounds, where we've asked folks to talk to us about their project ideas prior to the opening of the funding round, because once the funding round is open, we can't talk about specific projects. We can only clarify what's in the RFR. So we definitely encourage eligible municipalities, MVP designated communities to fill out an EOI form for any project ideas that you may have, and that will actually set up a short call with your MVP regional coordinator to discuss just some feedback on the idea and decide whether to move forward with a full application. It is optional this round, but we hope that it's a good opportunity for everyone to think about project ideas and what might be competitive for the MVP program. And we ask that you fill out the expression of interest by February 26th, if you can, so that we can have plenty of time to set up those calls with you. And so information about all of this, all of these items that I just talked about are in the newsletter that came out a couple weeks ago. And you can also find this information on our new webpage that I talked about before. I also just wanted to make a quick plug about that second half of the Nature-Based Solutions webinar. So if you're interested in that, definitely let us know. We'll drop the link to the chat. Sometimes people have trouble clicking on the links in this chat function. So we'll also follow up with an email after this webinar with some links that will be helpful for those kinds of things. So that is all I had. I'll turn it back to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Kara. So we're gonna jump right in. We have a full agenda today. Project team from the APC and the Nemasket River watersheds. They're gonna talk about their watershed management planning efforts. That's Helen, Bill, and Nancy. We have Ross and Patrick, and they're gonna talk about stream connectivity within the Ipswich River watershed and how it fits into the broader Parker-Ipswich-Essex River resilience work throughout the region. And then we're going to have Julie Wormser, and she's going to talk about resilient Mystics strategies for building partnerships that extend across municipal boundaries. And if we have time at the end, we're going to have the Q&A panel session with questions that are going to be fielded from your chats. So the important thing is, as we go through these presentations, it's going to be really important to drop questions into the chat box, because that's going to be how we steer the discussion in between each of the presentations. So next slide, please. So first, we have the next, so we're right on track. So between 110 and 145, we're going to talk about the Assawompset Ponds Complex, APC. It's a fascinating project, and we have 3 speakers today. We have Helen Zincavage. She is the Assistant Director of Environmental Programs at the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. She is the Consultant Team Project Manager for the APC MVP Action Grant that we're going to be talking about today. We have Bill Napolitano, and he's the Environmental Director at SERPED. And Bill has built his decades-long environmental planning career around strong and positive partnerships with communities and organizations across the SERPED region. And finally, we have Nancy Yates. Last but not least, she is the Environmental Manager of the APC complex, and she serves the towns of Lakeville, Middleborough, and Freetown to that role. And Rochester, as well as the cities of New Bedford and Taunton. So APC provides drinking water for over 250,000 residents, and she's always been an advocate for protecting Lakeville's natural resources, demonstrated by her record of public service, including membership on multiple committees and boards. So those are our lovely and talented speakers, our incredibly talented speakers today. And with that, I will turn it over to Helen, who will be our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Helen. Thank you guys all for joining us and for being curious about our project. We're just very passionate about this project, so it's very exciting to be able to share with you today. And we're always so grateful to the MVP program for providing this like center of gravity for us to do this kind of resilience work around. It's been really excellent. So I'll get right into it. Our project, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but we are developing a regional watershed management and climate resilience plan for the Assawompset Ponds Complex and the Namasket River. Next slide. All right, so we're going to get into the who, what, where of this all. Go ahead. Yeah. All right, so just kind of to give everyone an idea of where we're located and kind of what the APC and Namasket River are. The APC is actually the largest naturally occurring ponds complex in the state, and it spans 4 towns. So we have Middleborough, Lakeville, Freetown, and Rochester, all kind of span around the ponds. And it involves, outside of those kind of adjacent communities, it's also the drinking water supply to about 250,000 people, especially the cities of Taunton and New Bedford, and then some other towns throughout the region as well. So we have this really interesting situation where there's these communities that are kind of the frontline communities that have to deal with things like flooding when they occur, but we also have other management partners relying on this water supply for very important reasons that aren't right adjacent to it. So in addition to kind of the community and water supply role that it plays, it's an very important environmental resource because it's the spawning ground for river herring. They journey up the Taunton River, up the Namasket. So hundreds of thousands of herring make this journey every year. It's also important habitat for species like mussels, species of birds, and others as well. There's a component of the pond system that's very heavily residential and recreational. And so we're kind of have all these interests and all these stakeholders involved in this one ponds complex. It's a lot going on in one place. So go ahead, Andrew, next slide. All right, so this kind of gives you a zoomed out version of that, of what I was just speaking about, how it involves these multiple towns, and the black border is kind of the extent of the watershed of the APC and the Namasket River. So this is our plan area, and it also kind of demonstrates how the land surrounding the ponds, a lot of it to the west, is kind of privately owned or owned by specific towns, whereas the land on the eastern portion is owned by, a lot of it's owned by New Bedford. So there's just a lot of different, it's a vast area, a lot of different stakeholders. And right here in the picture, our particular project, the reason why we kind of chose the APC and the Namasket River is because the Namasket River is the principal outfall from the ponds complex. The ponds complex is the headwaters for the Namasket. And so it's mediated by this dam structure here that's problematic for a few reasons, but it's really the nexus of the APC and then its outlet at the Namasket. Next slide, go ahead, Andrew. All right. So in creating a watershed management and climate action plan, we have a few specific project goals. We want to address existing issues, kind of what I was just summarizing, balancing all these interests, kind of consider the dynamic forces that are going to shape this area into the future, including climate change, and then also new development that we expect to occur around the ponds. Our goal for this is to have a living document that can reflect, be referred to, but also change going forward as different paradigm shifts occur, as the context changes. And then we want to, the last point I think I already covered, kind of manage those competing interests. So go ahead, next slide, Andrew. So this is the project team. The APC management team, this is a pre-existing body of people from multiple different entities and agencies that have come together for, I think, about a decade now, meeting quarterly to think about the ponds complex, especially in managing water levels between water supply and adjacent communities. So you can see that the management team consists of different water divisions from New Bedford and Taunton, the APC environmental manager, who is Nancy, who we have here with us today, the Middleborough Lakeville Herring Fishery Commission, the Mass Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, different select board members from Lakeville, Middleborough, Freetown are involved, and then our local state legislative team often sends members to observe these meetings as well. So for this project, we had that pre-existing body to kind of draw on for the steering committee. And we also brought in additional town staff from the 6 communities that are really crucial to this management plan area. So those are the town staff that are listed on that right-hand column there. Most of them are conservation agents or planners or focusing on resiliency in their town or city. So next slide. So we consider the existing state, like that's really the nexus of the project team, because those are the people who have been kind of it's been the stewardship hub for this region for many years now, and we're kind of bringing just our own project level expertise to it and trying to advance their vision really. So this is our consultant project team. So we have me and Bill from Serped. We have Danica Warrens from Mass Audubon, Maria and Sarah from the Nature Conservancy, Eric Wahlberg, Neil Williams from Manomet, and we have our engineering partners, Neil Price and Ellie Baker from Horsley Witten Group, and then crucially our Courtney Rocha, our MVP regional coordinator. All right, next slide, please. All right. So we're doing this management plan, but there's a lot going on right now in this area and a lot of work and energy being put into this that we're trying to leverage kind of against each other to make sure we have the best outcome that we can at the moment. So we have 6 ongoing projects just in this area, the APC, that's focused on the APC at the moment. The top row is the watershed management plan, and it has the longest time horizon. So the kind of red line shows you here where each project kind of should culminate. But really, we have an EPA-led WMOS analysis looking at the best kind of optimizing stormwater capture for this watershed. We've been able to organize a technical study for some hydraulic and hydrologic systems for the Nemasket River. We have a community outreach component that goes along with this, and then we have a couple of technical surveying studies. So we're really excited that all of this is happening at once. We see all of the kind of things, the rows below the management plan, as getting us information that is going to feed into the management plan. It's kind of the data that we need to input to make some informed recommendations, and it's a place we can capture the recommendations that come out of these other projects. So next slide, Andrew. So that's not to say that that's necessarily easy to manage, because it gets a little complicated. It gets complicated for us as the project team, in that some parts of this have their own steering committees, some parts have, it's a lot of moving pieces, but we just try to keep ourselves kind of as organized as possible in terms of understanding the timeline for everything, and the geographic scope, because different components of these studies have different geographic areas. That's kind of what this is representing. There's different bridge crossings in this region, and things kind of align by bridge crossing. But so all of this information is going to go into the Watershed and Climate Action Plan. All right, next slide, Andrew. So we wanted to leave a lot of this conversation. We wanted this to kind of be a conversation, so we're just doing a broad overview here. But before we kind of go into a question and answer period with me and Bill and Nancy, we just wanted to highlight some major themes in our regional project development approach. So for our MVP plan, we were able to, we were very fortunate that there was an existing group of regularly convening stakeholders dedicated to the APC and Nemasket River. So there was already that existing infrastructure, that existing focused group that was giving this region its attention. We think that throughout some of these projects, having the RPA there as a regional entity focusing on regional work has been a helpful connector between different stakeholders, but also between different project components. So then we have a consultant team with long-standing relationships as members of the Resilient Taunton Watershed Network. That the kind of consultant project team slide I showed, we were all Audubon, Serped, Horsley Witten, all those partners are part of our town, that Resilient Taunton Watershed Network group. So we kind of meet on an ongoing basis, whether we have a project or not at the moment. And now we have one that's like we're sinking our teeth into and we're able to work on together, but we have that pre-existing long-standing kind of watershed level regional focus that we routinely work with. And then in building momentum across projects, we've been able to kind of make sure we're not putting all of our eggs in one funding basket, and kind of having this approach that, okay, we're going to be able to add project components as funding opportunities come up. We can be nimble and flexible and add on things, and that's how we're getting all that really good input to put into the larger plan umbrella. And then pursuing matching funds outside of local contributions, we found that like relying on that is not just everyone's budgets are so tight at the moment that really trying to think outside of what local towns would have to contribute is where we've kind of, I think, found a sweet spot of being able to fund these projects. All right, so that's all the summary that we were going to do, I think. Was that the last slide? I think. Okay, yep. Then I'll turn it over to you, Andrew and Carrie Ann, to MC this question and answer period.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. So I'm wondering, Nancy, as the municipal staff in this trio, if you might be able to talk about what advice you would offer other municipal staff who are looking to build a regional project. Oh, and you're muted right now, Nancy. And maybe before you answer, you could introduce yourself and tell us what your role is a little bit.
Okay, am I unmuted by the host? Okay. I'm the environmental manager of the Assawompset Pond Complex. Back in 2002, there were some very huge development opportunities for private people to come in and build on the shoreline of our drinking water, or Taunton and New Bedford's drinking water, which is also partially some of Lakeville's drinking water. And so people all came together and we wrote a grant to save 4,000 acres in perpetuity to protect that. It was 2.5 miles of shoreline that could have been developed into a huge complex of housing and septic and a water tower, and it really scared everybody, and everyone came together. Taunton, Bedford, Lakeville, all the adjoining towns came together, and with the help of the Trust for Public Land, we saved those 4,000 acres. And with that came a management plan. And that management plan was how to protect the drinking water now that it would be open for public to access the property. Of those 4,000 acres had been private property for years and not allowed the public, and now it was open to the public, so we did a management plan which brought everyone together. So that was really important because the management plan called for quarterly meetings, and since 2002 we've come together with quarterly meetings on how to protect this area, which you never realize until it's open to the public, I think, how much work and time and trouble it takes to do stewardship of the land. So we all came together on a quarterly basis since 2002. All of our towns have worked with SERPED. I think it's really, really important that people work with their local planning agency because they have kind of an overview. We all work with each other, but SERPED has had and has worked with all of us, and that's how we all got our objectives into a regional plan. We all put in when we all developed our MVP plans, SERPED helped all the communities, and we all had matching problems that we needed to deal with. So I think that was a main wonderful thing. And then the perfect storm happened when the grant for MVP came out, when we all had the same things we were looking, all the problems we were looking to correct. We all had flooding, the drinking water was endangered. We have undersized culverts. The dam, as you could see from the picture, is antique. It's 100 years old. It needs some kind of either taken out, a new dam, retrofitting, and that's what this is all about, how we're trying to figure out how to get a plan going forward. And MVP like I say, it was a perfect storm when MVP came along, that we were all together and we're all working on the same problem and projects.
Great, thank you.
You're
Bill
welcome.
from, what was that?
You're welcome.
Oh, Bill, from your perspective, from what advice would you offer to municipalities who are considering these types of projects, or some of the best lessons that you've learned from this process, which is now almost 20 years in the making?
Well, I think one of the things that you do is the continuity that you have in the community and the assets you have in the community. The people who have been involved in these things, don't overlook institutional knowledge and always engage the public. The fact that Nancy has quarterly meetings that she's held since 2002, I, as the regional planning agency representative, have participated in most of those meetings at Nancy's invitation. And it's really critical because you can see when opportunities arise to do things. In the past, Nancy, as Nancy said, we've worked with all of the towns, we've done small grants, we've tried to address issues as they've come up through planning boards, conservation commissions, sometimes boards of selectmen. And when the MVP program came around, everybody was really eager to do this, and they asked the RPA if we could help. So what we did was we actually put together, through the Resilient Taunton Watershed Network team, Manomet, Mass Audubon, Serpide, and the Nature Conservancy. We went out and we worked with the 4 host towns of the ponds. And again, we brought in a lot of the old timers, people who go back even beyond the 2002 date that Nancy was talking about. Because when you go back and do the research, a lot of these problems have been listed since the 1970s, going back with the USDA. Fortunately here, there's me and a couple of other old codgers who have been around since then. We actually worked with the USDA. We reviewed some of those early plans, and you really see the relevance of the work that was done by people previously to fold in to the things that people are still looking for now. You know, the next generation, you're into your 3rd generation of dealing with the same problems that have been brought to public light but not addressed. Like many problems we face in society, things get brought to public light and they're not addressed. So at this time, once we put them out with the MVP plans, and in the MVP plans, we exposed them again. We realized that these problems existed for a long time, and in fact, they never were addressed. So we saw the perfect, like Nancy called it the perfect storm, but it was the perfect opportunity to kind of put all of our planning knowledge into one area and say, what do we truly need? And the one theme that had recurred through the entire history of the Assawompset ponds and the numerous problems was the need for a comprehensive management plan so that the host communities, the communities that were in control of the water supply, and even the recipients of that water supply, our natural communities, the herring, you know, the mussels, everything else, the eagles, that everybody benefited, so that it was an ecological equity. How can we treat this as an entire ecosystem that has to be repaired? And that's the approach we took. And Nancy used a couple of great words. The MVP program offered us the opportunity to be flexible and nimble. And I would throw responsive in there too, because once the MVP planning documents were done, we immediately became eligible for MVP action grants. And one of the things that Helen and I have been trying to do inside, we joke about it, we say, we can put together proposals with table scraps as well as a main dish. And we have been able to leverage partnership contributions. Helen had the WMOST program in her slides, and we've been working with Naomi Dietenbach with EPA's Office of Research and Development on that. We had done some pilot projects, but that's a value added. We have an Nemasket River study that's a value added that we worked with the local Taunton River Stewardship Council, the stewards of the Taunton Wild and Scenic River. They have a grants program. We leveraged money from there. The SNEP network, we leveraged technical assistance from there to do the hydrologic and hydraulic study on the Nemasket River. So we've been able to bring in more partners to the mix. And you saw the slide of that room. What's typically, and Nancy can probably attest to this, maybe, you know, a dozen people on a good day meeting at the Assawompset Ponds Committee. We now have 34, 35 people sometimes attending, and they're all stakeholders and they're all participants. So we've increased the value of what we have on the ground. We've increased our capabilities to address the programs, and we've increased the network and communication amongst partners. I mean, it's seamless now. We all call one another, we email one another, we do Zoom. I mean, curse of the universe, but we do Zoom whenever we can. But it's to keep in contact and to keep up to date with the latest information so we don't ever fall into that 40-year black hole again. And that was the promise that we made, Helen and I and the RTWM partners. Once these projects are brought to light through this new process, they will never go back into the shadows again. These are problems, these are solutions. We plan with you, not at you. This is your plan, and you're going to give it life when it's finished. And that's the way we're approaching it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You touched on the importance of leveraging partnerships in building value for your project. And one of the questions from the chat is asking directly about matching funds. And so I'm wondering if somebody on your team could speak a little bit to what that process has been like for you all, whether that's through partnerships or through the municipalities that are a part of the regional project. And if also you could just remind us how many municipalities are a part of this project.
Well, either Helen or I can do it. I'd be.
Bill, I think.
Okay, sure. Right now we have the 6 municipalities, the 4 host communities, the 2 water suppliers, but people are invited in on an ancillary basis if they would like to come. But those are the mainstays. And as far as leveraging, what we've been able to do is reach out to other stakeholders who have similar goals and objectives in the Assawompset Ponds watershed. I mentioned the Taunton River Stewardship Council before. The Nemasket River and the Nemasket River watershed is part of what they call a focus area tributary to the main stem of the Taunton. And their outstanding resource values for which they were designated wild and scenic included fisheries and habitat and biodiversity, retention of biodiversity. So when we put in for our watershed management plan grant, we went to the Taunton River Stewardship Council to see if they were willing to fund a project that included the Nemasket. We brought them in. I had worked with EPA on a similar project, the WMOST, the Watershed Management Optimization Support Tool. We had worked with Naomi on a pilot project a couple of years ago up in the Wading and 3 Mile River watersheds in Norton and Mansfield. So I got on the phone and I said, how would you like to try this in the Assawompset Ponds watershed? Here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it. And she jumped in. The SNEP network saw that one of the deficiencies that we really need if we're going to approach the dam and approach flows and do it in a somewhat realistic fashion, we needed an updated hydrologic and hydraulic model for the Nemasket. So we, along with our partners at Horsley and Witten and Lakeville, we wrote a grant to get some technical assistance from the SNEP network. And we were able to leverage $80,000 from the SNEP network in technical assistance funding to hire the consultant to do the engineering work. So it's really looking at what you have, what you want to do, and looking at the resources that are out there. That's why I said, don't exclude anybody. Look at institutional knowledge, look at the old needs, and through networking, I think the real strength of us and the strength of success comes from constant communication and constant meeting, the ability to reach out to one another at any time. We always give each other a heads up when we hear about movement on the grants front or available technical assistance, and we try to match what's out there to the goals and objectives of the things we want to do to create a comprehensive watershed management and climate response plan. So we've been very fortunate in being able to find partners that way through our network to jump in and actually give us some much greater value added. You know, as far as it's not just about monetary things, it's about partnerships and increasing the partnership. And I would say the best thing about value added too is once this exercise is over, and that'll be the exercise, will be developing a plan. And I talked about adding life to it by the locals and how they use it. The partners will always be in the pipeline. You establish lifelong partnerships. These are the agencies that birth the plan. So these are the agencies that you'll be able to go back to in implementing the plan and bringing it to life. And that's critical.
Yeah, and I'll just add onto that very concretely. So our match is comprised of a pool of federal funds, and then through the Taunton River Stewardship Council, right, essentially, and then the private funds from the Nature Conservancy. And so those were our two match sources very concretely. And the match amount did constrain our overall ask for the grant, because you have to be able to, it has to reach a certain percentage. So that's what we based the overall amount on. It was like, okay, we know that we can come up with this much match. So then how much of the plan can we then fund through MVP, and how much are we going to have to do what kind of Bill was saying, get these other component pieces that's to feed into it. So whatever we're not going to be able to cover kind of with this one pool of funding, how can we get that somewhere else? And it's all part of one big essential project, but it has a bunch of different little components. And it's been such a fascinating view of like, it's been really hard to manage the complexity of those things kind of happening simultaneously, but it's been so worth it because we've been able to leverage those sources basically and get done all the components we need to get done for the overall plan.
And as far as boots on the ground, don't overlook the boots on the ground. You're always looking for new people. I mean, I'm the first one. I've been doing this for 20 years, and anybody that wants to come and go on a tour and look and see what we have, because we have a very unique resource area shared by a lot of people. So don't overlook new partnerships that you might have. Somebody says, oh, what is the Assawompset Pond Complex? Well, come on down. I'll be happy to show you. And I've been doing this for 20 years, so it ties it all together. It might not seem like anything taking somebody on a tour that you don't even know, but sooner or later, those ties and those partnerships form. So boots on the ground.
Excellent. One of the things that's coming out of these webinars generally is that once there is a post-COVID world where there needs to be MVP field trips to specific site projects, and it would definitely, I'm sure that many on this webinar would love to take you up on your boots on the ground tour option to be able to see what it is that you all are doing. One of the things that you've all mentioned in different ways, there are the partners that are from organizations and municipalities, but then I think it was you, Bill, who mentioned the locals as their own group. Could you talk a little bit about what it's been like building buy-in from the local communities and what your outreach strategies have looked like?
The outreach strategy from the beginning, and again, I was fortunate that I go back so far with some of these plans, was to bring the people back in who were part of those plans to begin with, or their organizations were, because a lot of the same people weren't around. You're talking 40 years. But bring them back in, and I think the way we build a plan, and I said this before too, we plan with you, not at you, and we made that very clear to the community. We invited people in, we said, this is what we'd like to do, this is how we'd like to do it, but guess what? You're driving the bus. We work with you. These are your towns. We would like to plan for your towns as though we live there. And the only way we can do that is to tap into your local expertise. Because what Nancy said too, you have the boots on the ground every day. You're the ones who had to deal with the local floods, the invasives, the fish hang-ups, the water quality, everything that's happened over the last 40 years. You're the reason that the USDA went out and did the plans to begin with. You're the reason that the state responded and set up the bioreserve out on Betty's Neck that Nancy was referring to before, the 4,000 acres. So you have been driving the bus. It's just getting them back in the room and telling them that they still do drive the bus. And I've had great meetings with the local fishermen's, the Herring Fisheries Commission, the conservation commissions and planners are fabulous. The local people who volunteer for these commissions have been totally supportive and involved. And the thing is, you open the door and invite them in early and say, this is about you. This is your plan. And when we leave, we're going to be here with you till it's done, soup to nuts. But you're the people who add life to these plans. And a lot of times the first thing you hear about people when you convene a planning group is, oh, is this just going to be another copy of the Boston phone book, or is this going to be a paperweight? Is this going to be on the shelf? And I said, this will not be, because we won't let it, because your promise and your involvement in this plan predicates that you have to bring it to life. We're doing this for you and with you. So it's yours. When we leave, it's still your town's. And we've had, like I said, great response. The volunteers have been absolutely fabulous. The local people have been fabulous. And again, it's a communication thing. When they have questions, they have no problem stepping up and communicating with us directly. Phone, email, anytime, day or night. And it's a nice open dialogue that we have. And that's the way it should be with the communities. If you're a regional planning agency, you should be able to work with your communities that way. And if you're a project group, Helen's managing the group tremendously as far as her outreach and her accessibility. We have, and she can tell you more about it too, we set up a project page where people, again, call in any day or night or email and leave comments, questions, the whole bit. So we always have something to do. There's not a lull, which again keeps the project alive on the ground, because people think a lot of times, oh, we're going to get people into plan. They're going to take the money, disappear, and 6 months later, they'll come back and hand us a plan and say, here's what you need. That is anything but this process. This is so involved. So I'll let Helen tell you a little bit about what she's got set up.
Yeah, we can keep, I want to be conscious of time, so I'll keep it pretty short, but we do have the, like Bill mentioned, like just finding that steering committees, as I do more and more projects in my career, like all of them have to have a steering committee because that meets regularly. And we have that essential steering committee here too.
Excellent. I'm curious, for as one last question before we move on, what are your hopes of what will come out of this project, of what will be the next steps?
Some of the things that we've outlined are, well, we all went around, each of our different spokespersons that were contributing went around what was their most important project. We all have our pet projects. Herring and Fisheries have a pet project. My pet project that was a huge factor in the grants, in the floods back in 2010, was the culvert that was replaced on Route 18, which connects Long Pond, which is 1,700 acres, flows into Assawompset Pond, which is 2,400 acres. And it took a full 10 days for that. When they replaced the culvert, it was undersized. And it takes a full 10 days for the level of Long Pond to come down and equal out to Assawompset, which means all those people and homes, over 200 people lost their homes that were flooded out. So my pet project is to see that culvert replaced, which was an unfortunate thing that project was done 2 years before the state passed a law that the culverts have to be open bottomed, and that's what we need. And that would be that was my number one. With other people, Taunton, New Bedford, I think their number one might be doing something to help the antique dam work better. And then Fisheries and Wildlife would like to see the river cleaned out. So we all have our pet projects. So hopefully they'll all get done. In what order, that remains on funding. So we'll see how that goes.
Totally, yeah. Just picking up on that, Nancy, just the implementation would be the next goal. Like if we have our plan, we have our priorities, and then let's get to work getting more funding to do design and engineering, construction. And then also having policy coordinated across different towns is going to be, I think, a really important outcome of this as well, and with state agencies and all the players involved.
Great. So I think we are right at 1:45. Carrie Ann, do you have any more questions for our APC team?
Nope, we're good to go. Thank you all so much.
Awesome. So one of the things that I picked up from their presentation was there's something that came out of the environmental justice and community engagement presentation, which was that engagement has to happen early and often, and that was something Carrie Ann referenced in relationship to what our EJ director Rishi Reedy had said about engagement and what engagement meant. And what I'm hearing is that these sort of regional partnerships, in order to be successful, it sounds like frequent engagement that happens often is just a part of success. So that seems like a cross-cutting strategy on two of our different webinars that we've had so far that people can bring forward and think about in their own towns. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now we have Boxford, Ipswich, and Topsfield, and so this is a really cool project. We have Ross Povenmire. He is the director of land use for the town of Boxford. So he's serving as the conservation agent and also works with the planning and community preservation committees. So as a former conservation agent, I know how busy it is to staff all those committees. So hats off to you, Ross. He's retired as an attorney and a landscape architect, and he worked for many years in planning and environmental consulting. He's been with the town of Boxford for 17 years. And so we also have Patrick Lynch, who's filling in, and he's doing a great job. I'm looking forward to seeing what he's going to say. But Patrick Lynch is an environmental planner at the Ipswich River Watershed Association. He also coordinates the PIE, the Parker-Ipswich-Essex Rivers Partnership up on the North Shore. So we've got them from 1:45 to 2:20, and they're going to talk about a regional culvert mapping and connectivity project that's going to help build stream connectivity. So with that, over to who was our first speaker? Is it Patrick? Let's go over to
I'll be
Patrick.
speaking first.
Oh,
Yep.
Over to Ross. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. So this project was funded in large part by the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant. It's called Increasing Regional Flood Resiliency, Redesigning Culverts in the Howlett Brook Watershed. The Howlett Brook is a stream that is located primarily in the towns of Boxford, Topsfield, and Ipswich, and it flows into the Ipswich River, and then a short distance later, the Ipswich River empties out into Plum Island Sound, and then that opens out right near Cranes Beach. That might be a landmark for some of you, and then into the Gulf of Maine. So this is all an area that is just sort of north and northwest of Cape Ann, where Gloucester is, and so forth. So that's the area of Massachusetts we're talking about. The town of Boxford, in their municipal vulnerability preparedness plan, identified flood resiliency as one of their main issues and areas of improvement, desired improvement. And so when the Ipswich River Watershed Association approached me and asked if Boxford would be willing to participate as a lead in this MVP project, I was very happy to do that. And a subtitle of this project could very easily be increasing stream connectivity, ecosystem restoration, fish migration improvement, because all of those things happen when you redesign the culverts and make them compatible with the new stream crossing standards and with the fish migration. And so those sort of benefits that automatically occur, so to speak, are of great interest to the Ipswich River Watershed Association and to Trout Unlimited, which were other partners in this project. And in addition to that, we also had the towns of Topsfield and Ipswich. So the takeaway is that although the project served different interests in different ways for different partners, for all the partners, a regional and watershed approach resulted in the greatest benefit. So that's the bottom line, and we'll talk more about that. So next slide, please.
All right. So Ross will do the next couple, and then it's back to you. Hi, everybody. So as Ross mentioned, Ipswich River was really involved in this project. We did a lot of the project management and admin. Trout Unlimited were also really key. They were the design and engineering consultants. And for those of you who haven't worked with TU, they are, as a mission-based organization, really trying to provide lower cost engineering and design services to help increase the pace at which these projects happen. They're great partners. And again, as Ross mentioned, there's so many co-benefits that happen when you can restore culverts, especially when you look at the regional impacts, which is something that we're very interested in. And then in addition to getting the MVP program funds, we also had funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, sometimes referred to as NIFWF, and also the local chapter of TU put in some funding. Next slide, please. And again, just to reiterate, the project partners, the leads on this were not just Ipswich River and TU and the town of Boxford, but also our neighboring towns in Topsfield and Ipswich. And I know Ross is going to talk more about this, but the project included surveying all 18 culverts along the main stem and primary tributaries. It was a fairly significant project for all three communities. Next slide, please. All right, so this is where we talk about the regional context. And, you know, in thinking about, again, and it's a theme that I think Helen mentioned and Bill and several others have already brought up, that, you know, this project happened because of an existing partnership that had already been formed. And this is the Parker-Ipswich-Essex rivers. It is known colloquially on the North Shore as Pie Rivers. We occasionally have pie at our meetings back before we went virtual. And so one of the goals really is thinking about resiliency projects across the North Shore and across the 29 different communities that either use the water or exist within the Parker-Ipswich-Essex rivers. And Ross, it should be pointed out, also serves on the steering committee of Pie Rivers. The actual committee is formed of a number of town representatives and also regional reps from CZM. In the past, we've had folks from some of the regional planning agencies. We currently work closely with MVPC, given that the northern part of our region is all in the Merrimack Valley or within their communities. Really, in our region, and this is somewhat different from, I know what we'll hear next from Julie about the communities in the Mystic area. The concerns up on the North Shore are really about low flows, drinking water supply. We really feel the impacts of drought in our communities since our drinking supply is oftentimes tied to the health of the river. That's obviously not great from a resiliency standpoint, but from a needing folks to collaborate standpoint, it's very effective. There's other issues that we worry about as well, coastal sea level rise being a big one, particularly for our coastal communities along the Great Marsh, which you can see in this map. And then of course, erosion, increased storms, and everything else. So in 2019, Pie Rivers conducted a strategic planning process. The main goal of that was, again, increasing the pace at which these partnership projects can happen. So next slide, please. And so the result of that strategic planning was the creation of 4 implementation plans, which we really view as near-term priorities, of which river and stream continuity is a big one. We also have land use, water quality management, and water conservation. And taken together, these plans for us really tell a story about the need to collaborate across communities, for thinking about watershed scale collaboration, but also cross watershed collaboration, especially in coastal areas like ours, where again, a lot of the flow issues commingle when you get down into the Great Marsh. So what happens in one community can impact another, and really trying to identify not just the physical barriers, which is what we'll be looking at the rest of the presentation when it comes to things like stream continuity, but also looking further afield at some of the economic and of course the political and the cultural barriers to getting our communities to work together. And especially the work on land use, which is where I focus a lot of my time on, and water conservation, we're talking about dealing with multiple planning agencies, zoning, trying to look at low impact development and everything else that I'm sure a lot of folks today spend a lot of time on. I will just say that we recognize, I think we're doing a great job, but there's a lot of work that we still need to do. And we're always looking for new partnerships. If anybody's interested, please contact us. And I know Ross is now gonna go back to the actual details of this project, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
Okay, so you can see behind the text here a general outline of the watershed of the Pye Rivers region. And the project that we're talking about was intended to provide 30% design plans for 18 culverts. And these culverts were selected based on prior work that was done by the Ipswich River Watershed Association, a prior survey of the entire watershed, and out of that survey came 18 culverts along the main stem of the Howlett Brook that were of key interest for upgrading, for improvement. And next slide, please. This is the Howlett Brook watershed, which is a portion of the watershed you saw in the previous slide. And that crooked line that drops right down through the middle of the page there, that is I-95. And just to the left of that is Hood Pond. And Hood Pond is a convenient landmark. It's kind of the geographic center of the watershed. And then right down in the lower right-hand corner is where Howlett Brook enters Ipswich River. Almost everything to the left of Hood Pond is Boxford. And then the rest of the watershed is divided between the towns of Ipswich and Topsfield. Next slide, please. So you can see Hood Pond in the far left edge of the image. Remembering back to the prior slide, everything on the left-hand side, pretty much of the left half of the page, is the Howlett Brook watershed. The confluence is right in the middle of the page. And then in the upper right-hand corner of the page is where the Ipswich River flows flows over the Ipswich Mill Dam, and then very, very shortly off the page into Plum Island Sound. So in the Howlett Brook watershed, there were 52 culverts, dams, other impediments that were studied. Primarily, they were studied in a previous effort for the risk of failure and for the compliance with the state stream crossing standards. 18 of those culverts were then selected for this Howlett Brook study. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're in the upper watershed. In the very, very lower right-hand corner, you can just make out a little piece of Hood Pond. And then you see I-95 there, and where it says Ipswich Road Culvert in the far upper left corner, that is really the headwater of the Howlett Brook. So you're looking at from the midpoint of the watershed up to the headwaters. And you see several culverts called out in the town of Boxford that were part of the study. These are all on the main stem. In Boxford, Howlett Brook is called Pye Brook. And these were the culverts that were studied. Next slide, please. This is an example of the 30% design plan and cost estimate on the far right that were developed by the study. And in almost all cases, involved a significant upsizing of the culvert. Many of these culverts are, especially in Boxford, are old stone culverts or rotted out corrugated metal culverts. And so this plan, for example, here would represent a tremendous improvement in the capacity of that stream crossing to pass flows. So obviously very highly desirable. There's enough room inside that culvert for wildlife passage, for a natural substrate, and all the good things that come with the modern stream crossing standards. It is hoped that a plan like this and the accompanying cost information will be a helpful tool for the municipalities in their planning process. And here's where you get into the sort of the local process for converting this information into an actual project on the ground. And you know, this involves all kinds of new players, the boards of selectmen, the DPW superintendents, the abutters, the dam owners, the people who are on either side of the road where the culvert is located. All of these people become stakeholders in that process as well. So this project takes it to this point, and there's still work to do. Next slide, please. As an example of work to do, here are some of the impediments on the river. We have beaver dams. We have sort of homegrown barriers thrown across culverts to either keep beaver out or to raise the water level in people's own backyard pond to a level that they prefer. There are sort of crossings that are off the road that are historic sort of causeways that people have built to access portions of their property across to the other side of the stream. So these are the sorts of things that still need to be addressed that were not addressed in this study. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide, Carrie Ann?
One second. We'll,
well, it may be locked up, but in any case, the next slide is just an additional set of photos showing impediments. And in Boxford, for example, we've had people put plywood across culvert openings in order to raise the water level and that kind of thing. So there's an enforcement matter, component to that as well. So the bottom line is this was I believe, a very useful project. The second phase of it will be at the municipal level to try to make those plans a reality. And hopefully having the plans and the cost estimates will expedite that, will facilitate that.
so I think we might have lost Hillary. I'm not sure. So Hillary's dropped out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the presentation from my screen, and we will be back up and running. So we have multiple fail safes. So this is something that people can keep in mind for their meetings in the future.
Well, the good news is we were pretty much done with the slides. So
oh, good.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about the project. There were some interesting developments in terms of actually trying to get some of the information in the field, which raise a lot of questions about um, uh, engaging the local community in advance. In a nutshell, we weren't able to get all of the information we wanted at some of the culverts because the homeowners were not inclined to allow that to happen. And so that is unfortunate, but from a homeowner's perspective, they uh, apparently were concerned about what that would mean for them and their properties and so forth. So that's an interesting component that needed to be addressed, I think, more comprehensively in this project and probably in regional projects in general.
Absolutely. The role that communicating with property owners is very huge, and I think Patrick at one point had spoken about some of the cultural and social challenges that this type of a project can encompass. And so I'm wondering if there's, in addition to sort of thinking about property owners, are there other lessons learned that you all have received going through this project?
You broke up a little bit. Are there other what that we received?
In terms of the social aspects and outreach and communication, some best lessons.
Well, one thing that was a bit of a surprise to me was that when the time came for me to reach out to homeowners and say, let's say a property at 100 Main Street, just as a theoretical example, I found myself as a conservation agent of a regulatory board thinking to whether or not it would be an issue if I tried to convince somebody to allow survey to occur on their property for the benefit of this study, if that person eventually were to come back and say, well, I need a permit from your board. And so the end result was I was hesitant to, as a conservation agent and as a town official, in engaging homeowners too directly in this study. And I think that it would have been very helpful to have had more sort of engagement by other nonprofit or citizens groups or other groups, perhaps a river keeper group type of thing, such as the Ipswich River Watershed Association, but they were already engaged. So it's important to have municipal actors involved, but they are also constrained sometimes. So that was a surprising realization halfway through the project.
And that's a really interesting insight, since for many of our smaller communities, many folks are wearing multiple hats. So it is definitely something to be considered. There is a question here in the chat, Ross, asking about cost estimates for the culverts, if they are available online from your project, and what were the most significant drivers for the costs?
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, I wish Trout Unlimited were on the call and they would be able to speak to that. They're the ones who developed the cost estimates and the actual design plans. But by and large, the main drivers were the construction cost of the construction cost of installing the culvert, but also the permitting costs of getting the permits from the Conservation Commission and so forth for those crossings.
Mm. And so, leading off of that a little bit, thinking about the implementation of these findings, do you think that each community will now take the information and proceed at their own pace, or has there been some regional conversations around implementation?
Okay, so I have to confess I was very jealous of the people in the prior presentation, of all of the sort of outreach and sort of coordination and communication that was going on in my neck of the woods. Each town is quite distinct, and you know, they do things their own way. So Boxford will take these plans, and I've spoken with the DPW superintendent. I was in communication with him throughout this project. Um, he has told me that he is hoping to now get funding to implement those COVID improvements. You know, that will require multiple steps and so forth. So can I say with any degree of certainty how this will all pan out? I really can't at this time, but I certainly will be looking to push those projects over the course of time. But I'm one actor in many, among many at town, you know, in town government in Boxford. With regard to the other towns, I really am not able to say how they're going to proceed on that.
I understand. There's a question here in the chat asking about, did Trout Unlimited do the planning and cost estimates themselves, or did they hire professionals, and who paid for it?
Patrick, do you want to respond to that? Or I can, if you like.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, we could definitely follow up with TU afterwards and get. It sounds like there's a couple questions, so I don't know, Andrew, Carrie Ann, how that would work for. Can we send follow-up information afterwards? Is that all right?
Well, I can answer that question anyway, and that is that Trout Unlimited has their own engineers and has their, you know, the ability to do this work, and so they did that work. They did it in-house as subcontractors to the Ipswich River Watershed Association, and the grant was paid out to the Ipswich River Watershed Association primarily.
Thank you. In thinking about the different towns that are involved and Boxford working as the municipal lead on the MVP action grant, Ross, can you share with us a little bit about what that has involved for you, and what communications with the other towns has involved?
Okay, so the Ipswich River Watershed Association approached me to be the lead on this project because Boxford was an MVP community at that point, and an MVP community was needed in order to apply for the MVP action grant. Now, when I said earlier that the project satisfies different interests in different ways, but it improves overall by a regional watershed approach, what I mean, at least for Boxford, is Boxford would never have really been able to put this kind of project together on its own. So the regional watershed approach, as far as Boxford is concerned, in getting these plans, is that that was the only way these plans were going to happen for Boxford. For the Ipswich River Watershed Association, their primary interest was in sort of the regional watershed-wide effects on fish migration, ecosystem restoration, and so forth. So the interests are different, but they both benefit. the towns of Ipswich and the town of Topsfield basically were not that involved in the project. It was primarily Boxford, Ipswich River Watershed Association, and Trout Unlimited. The other two towns, I mean, I know the agents in those towns, and we would have occasional communication, but they were not involved in the grant writing, except in a very tangential way. They were not really involved in the grant administration. I think Trout Unlimited worked with them in terms of getting survey work done and access to various places within those towns. But otherwise, there wasn't that much communication, and that may be a place for improvement in the future.
Mm. Thank you. In the project before you, there were questions asking about match. And I'm wondering, that's always a question that it comes up with many communities in thinking about action grant projects. Could you share with us at all a little bit about what the process was like for this project?
Well, as far as Boxford was concerned, our match was in kind. The effort that Boxford put into administering the grant, and also our DPW superintendent is an engineer, and so he also spent some time reviewing the engineering drawings and making comments and so forth. So there was an in-kind match for Boxford. I can't speak to the other towns. I think there was some in-kind match from the other towns, but primarily this was a Boxford in-kind match for the grant.
Got it. Thank you so much. Well, I think that with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew and thank you and Patrick so very much for sharing about your project.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that was interesting to hear the differences between the two regions. You know, it's such a complex, complicated state that we all work in, and just the definitions that what a region is and how people work together. I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this particular project, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have someone from Mystic River Watershed Association come and speak to us. I think they have an interesting sort of like cross municipal governmental structure that they've set up, which is pretty fascinating. So we're going to have Julie. Julie Wormser. She's going to talk about. As I get to my speaker bios, she's going to talk about the work within the sort of like multiple projects that they've been working on, and it's kind of an umbrella for multiple projects to unfold, and you'll learn more about that. But here my text messages are blowing up, so I hope that give me a thumbs up if I'm okay. Am I okay, guys? Thumbs up, Kirian? Okay, cool.
Yep, you're great.
All right, cool. So Julie Wormser is the Deputy Director of the Mystic River Watershed Association and founder of the Resilient Mystic Collaborative. So since its launch in September 2018, the RMC has grown to include 20 municipalities and has secured over $2.5 million in funding to pursue regional climate preparedness projects. As Executive Director of the Boston Harbor Association, Wormser was instrumental in drawing attention to Boston's need to prepare for coastal flooding from extreme storms and sea level rise. She co-authored Preparing for the Rising Tide and Design with Water, and co-led the Boston Living with Water International Design Competition with the City of Boston and Boston Society of Architects. She has a BA in biology from Swarthmore College and an MPA from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So that's we're very fortunate to learn more about Julie's work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen with you so you can have your presentation. So we're going to have to do some back of the.
I think I'm good to go, Andrew.
Oh, good, great.
Yep.
Awesome. So thank you. Take it away.
Did that work?
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much. And one of the things that's really different between what we're doing and the last two presentations is that we really, I don't believe, could have done our work without the MVP program, because a lot of the lead municipalities in our group, the Resilient Mystic Collaborative, had already done their MVP plans and really knew that they couldn't solve their own problems within their own boundaries. So we're much newer and really from the beginnings was focused on climate. So the Mystic River watershed is basically drains into the north side of Boston Harbor. We're actually neighbors with Ipswich River watershed, but it doesn't feel like it because it's really, we're neighbors at the headwaters, and then we are so much more urban. So I'm not sure we really have a whole lot of culverts to speak of comparatively to what you all have been talking about. We do, however, like others, have a major governance challenge. The Mystic River watershed is about the same size as Amsterdam or Brooklyn, New York. But like other communities, we're also quite urban. We have 1% of the landmass of Massachusetts, but 10% of its population. But like other communities in Massachusetts, we're incredibly fragmented. So where Amsterdam is one municipality, Brooklyn is just a borough of New York City, we are 21 cities and towns, each with our own town meeting and budget and culture, et cetera, and staffing. And none of these staff really are tasked with working with their neighbors. So what can Amsterdam do that we can't do in our watershed? They can raise local and regional funds. They can strengthen their building codes. They can plan and regulate to scale. The thing about Massachusetts is we are proud of our Revolutionary War history. We want to keep the there. And as a result, our legislature purposefully moves slowly in order to keep our traditions. This is now very maladaptive as we're dealing with new challenges such as climate adaptation. The good news, though, is that our watershed has Tufts University, Harvard University. We're near something like 40 universities from which we pull a lot of expertise and student assistance. It creates a real learning lab environment. I think quite different from what you were talking about, Ross. We actually do have a culture of collaboration and sort of active learning. Of course, communities do control zoning. MVP program has been absolutely central to our success, not just for the money itself, but also the hope it provides and those initial planning grants. And then the other thing is that our municipal staff are really above and beyond. And if we had the same kind of nonpartisan collaboration and expertise and that real patriotism of my job is to protect our people and places, we had that at the federal government level, we would not be having the polarization we're having right now. We're just, it's an extraordinary privilege to work with folks. So the Resilient Mystic Collaborative is now 20 of our 21 cities and towns. You can see that just a little bit of Wilmington is in our watershed. And they help us on things like multi-signature letters, but predominantly they're in a different watershed. We were founded about 2.5 years ago after about 6 months of one-on-one meetings with communities. And we now are 98% of the watershed working actively together. And since our founding in 2018, we have been able to secure about $2.5 million in regional climate funding and even more so in individual municipal funding. The first 4 months, we started with 10 communities who were already thought leaders on climate. Nowhere did we have a climate 101. You know, everyone knew that they had problems. They were really ready to solve them. In the first 4 months, these 10 communities hacked out our vision and our working groups and our decision-making process. And this is what we came up with before asking everybody else to join. So we don't try to do everything climate. We are focused on regional projects, not planning, not training, that no single city or town can accomplish by itself. We are data-driven, and in our first 2 to 3 years, we've been really focused on laying down that regional data to drive our work. We are action-oriented. We're both pragmatic and optimistic. We see the Mystic River and its tributaries as tremendous resources. We are mutually supportive, and we've also created a governance structure that very mindfully helps us succeed and continue to learn. So I have the Partners Healthcare building behind us because that's where we were able to meet, and they were a key supporter of ours until we went virtual. But we actually, one of the first things we did was raise money to have professional facilitation. So each of our meetings, we wanted to be the best use of everybody's time, not waste a second, and also have people feel like this is the place to be. They're contributing, it's efficient, it's enjoyable. So I'm actually 100% funded just to co-facilitate the Resilient Mystic Collaborative. We have fundraised from the beginning for regional staff, who then fundraises for the RMC to have that capacity that people are talking about. Even though we're centrally staffed, the staff has no voting power. All of the voting members are municipal senior engineers, senior planners, one vote, one community. We also have non-voting experts in environmental justice, architecture, land use laws, who participate in discussions. We have much broader working groups that are designed to be fully inclusive. But we separated out sort of high trust, more exclusive, municipal-led steering committee, and then more inclusive voting working groups. Unfortunately, that has made us realize that our steering committee is almost entirely white and middle class, and we're now saying, how can we be more inclusive in our decision making while still maintaining that trust and collegiality? So our 4 working groups, again, this all came out of municipalities. One is social resilience, keeping our people safe from climate. Another one is storm-proofing our critical infrastructure. A third is state funding and policy. And a fourth is collective regional stormwater flooding. So if you look at this bird's eye view, bird's eye map of our watershed, we are really a tale of 2 watersheds, where our lower watershed is very, very developed. Our upper watershed has much more open space. We have a dam down that separates our saltwater and freshwater sections of the Mystic. So the upper Mystic is 17 communities collectively working to manage stormwater flooding, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. We have received $1.3 million in grants to look at stormwater flooding at a regional level. And what we ended up doing is looking for opportunities to create new stormwater wetlands. Again, I'll explain that in a moment more, but we're moving towards these, the opportunity to manage floodwater regionally. In the lower Mystic, we have the highest concentration of critical regional infrastructure. That includes everything from the MBTA, Logan Airport, Deer Island sewage treatment plant, and food distribution. And none of this is protected to the intense storms we're starting to experience, like a superstorm Sandy. We have secured $400,000 to do a regional vulnerability assessment. We brought 13 infrastructure facilities together to do a scenario of what if they were hit by a 2050, 1 in 100 winter nor'easter. We then had them both look at what would fail in their own facilities, but also how would these facilities affect each other. If you lost electricity, for example, that would cause the T to fail immediately. And then we're also in the process of doing a social vulnerability assessment, looking at how our most vulnerable residents and workers are affected by short or long-term failure of our infrastructure. Across the watershed, we have a full range of demographics, from high-tech billionaires to new Americans who are undocumented, to people who don't speak English, to very young and very old folks who have more fragile health, not to mention COVID. And so our goal as an entire watershed is to prevent the extreme weather coming from climate to affect the health, housing, and livelihood of the folks who are disproportionately affected. So we have raised over $500,000 to put together a professional practitioners network of environmental justice folks, public health commissioners, to look at how do we prioritize our folks who are affected most by climate. And one of the things we're doing is Wicked Hot Mystic, which again, I'll talk about in a moment. And so our goal is, because this is pretty complex work that we don't expect every municipality to gear up for, we're trying to have this standing cadre of experts to help municipalities integrate social resilience into their policies and budgets. And finally, as other communities know, our state budget and regulations don't necessarily work for our communities. And so we are using our strength as 10% of the state's population, as 21 municipalities, to work to increase the resiliency of our dam, which will start to fail in the coming decades, to propose improvements to Mass DEP regulations, such as the Stormwater Handbook. We polled all our folks about the MVP program and presented that to staff to say, here's how we think it could work better for municipalities. And we also think that MVP has to be much, much larger. Actually, can you hang on one sec? Fred, can you take this? It's Fred Clay. So one of the things we're working to do is lobby for MVP to be not $10 million a year, but we'd like to see it be $100 million a year. So it's really something that municipalities can rely on for climate funding. Just like schools and roads, this needs to be a core government function, not a competitive grant program. So to go a little deeper into two of our projects, the upper Mystic watershed, mostly it's that green area, is looking at managing precipitation flooding across municipal boundaries. So we started with Cambridge. They had spent over $1 million actually downscaling global climate projections into a Cambridge-specific project. And then they used a very specific InfoWorks model, 3D modeling, to look at how those more intense rainfall would interact with their stormwater system, and therefore where could they afford to develop? What should their zoning and development patterns be given more intense flooding? So we realized that with 21 municipalities, we couldn't do $1 million model in every municipality. What they ended up doing is giving this result to the entire watershed. We then added, for not much money at all, the stormwater infrastructure for the remaining communities. And so we now have a watershed-wide model that allows us to measure the impact of our, sorry, there's some stuff going on in the background, to measure the impact of our interventions to see if they will work for flood management. So our first theory of change is that if, like the Charles River, we could store more water in our headwaters, we would have less downstream flooding. So we found 465 areas that were 3 acres or more that could be potential restored or enhanced wetlands. We did a tabletop exercise a tabletop assessment to say, okay, go from 465 to 120 to 18 based on, would it work? Is it a brownfield? Is it a willing landowner? Are there other benefits like being nearby vulnerable communities? Does it also solve local flood issues? And we now chose our top 3 and have a second round of MVP funding to go to between 75 and 100% design based on whether we can get it through permitting. But one of the things we realized in doing this initial analysis is some of the areas that flood, it's actually very localized because of both intense precipitation and intense pavement. And so to some extent, even if we're able to do a lot of great upstream wetlands, Cambridge, Central Square in Cambridge will still flood if the rain is intense enough, that it's really about localized flooding, for example. So we're saying, okay, what else beyond these stormwater wetlands? Can we actively draw down our ponds before predicted heavy rainfall to keep water where it wants to be? Can we coordinate zoning and depaving, other stormwater management across the watershed so that one municipal solution doesn't cause more problems downstream? So that's one of our big multi-year projects. One of our second projects is to look at urban heat islands. And just like weather isn't racist and sun isn't racist, our past and current policies can put some people in harm's way more than others. And we're learning how much redlining has really caused problems today in terms of neighborhoods that are much hotter than their neighbors. So if you look on the left-hand side, that is redlining done by the Federal Housing, I don't know what the A is, Authority, Administration maybe, under FDR, where it says, where should we have banks invest? And it was really, unfortunately, a lot of it was based on what was the color of the skin of the people who lived in these areas. And so and that has changed over time. So for example, Jews and Irish folks back in the 30s were considered undesirable. They are no longer considered undesirable. And so those areas that had been redlined, like the North End, like Brookline, are no longer areas of divestment. Unfortunately, racism against African Americans continues to this day in places like Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester, continue to be disinvested compared to whiter areas. But what we're looking at in redlining in the 30s and how that led to disinvestment into these neighborhoods, we see those as being some of the hottest places today in Greater Boston. So unfortunately, the structural racism that happened because of the FHA is now causing problems as our climate's heating up. So the Museum of Science and Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline actually did something they called Wicked Hot Boston in 2019. These are the transects they did at the same time using car-mounted monitors to identify lived experience in terms of heat and humidity. And then they were able to use LiDAR data to extrapolate that to those areas. We're going to expand that in 2021 to the entire watershed and measure heat, humidity, and air quality in the morning, afternoon, evening, and then the next morning during heat waves next summer. That lays the groundwork for us to look at where are the hottest parts of our watershed, and then what can we do about them? How can we use those data to then drive community design interventions that both cool people off and also create enjoyable social spaces during the summer? So you can learn a lot more at resilient.mysticriver.org. But so far, so good. Our biggest challenge is that we are teeing up hundreds of millions of dollars in projects that we'd like to see happen, both for our infrastructure and green space, and then social interventions. So we are now turning to, again, lobbying for more state resources and looking to see if we can tap into federal resources as well. So that is my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. And it feels like a holiday wish to ask for MVP to have more money. So I'm here for putting that into the manifestation pile of things to happen, because there are so many projects that MVP would love to be funding. Thank you so much for all that you have offered in your presentation. There's a lot of questions that I'd like to pull out here, and I'm wondering if it was interesting hearing about the upper watershed and the lower watershed, and I'm wondering if you could talk about so here's this region of the watershed, and I imagine, as you're, citing redlining histories, that there's also complex histories between municipalities. And when thinking about the responsibilities and the opportunities of the upper watershed in potential for retaining and dispersing water, and then the impacts for that on the lower watershed, as an example, what are some of the challenges of working across this watershed, given the history, and getting the municipalities to think from this perspective?
That's a great question. I think the history, there's not a lot of conflict history. It's just much more siloing. Like when you were talking about it, it made me think of a cup, but then like a cup with 20 straws in it, where we don't realize we're all part of the same cup. That it was a little like people knew their own communities, and then around their municipal boundaries, there'd be dragons. So one of the gaps was really a gap in understanding of what was going on with their neighbors, because there was nobody tasked with that. So one of my hypotheses was that we would find a lot of opportunities at the very downstream end of a municipality, because they had no benefit to them for storing stormwater right as it's heading out into the next community. So why would they bother storing water there, dealing with flooding there? And then the community below had no ability to affect what was going on in their neighboring community. So I think what we ended up doing is having a shared knowledge. What we're learning is a shared knowledge of the hydrology of the entire watershed, which is interesting to everybody. We're upping everybody's game. Technically, again, big thanks to Cambridge for giving us a model that includes everybody. But the other thing is, where we have regional flooding, there's often local flooding, right? And so if we are solving a regional flooding problem, there are local benefits, both in terms of local flood benefits, but also local conservation land, new walking areas, new habitat. And so a lot of it is that you are pulling resources from downstream into benefits to upstream that also convey regional benefits. So we so far have only had communities say, pick me, not like, over my dead body do I want a new piece of nice open space. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is when you have a priority that isn't actually beneficial to the region, and so you don't necessarily get the regional shoulder behind you. Right,
and you were saying that I don't know what they were called, if they were like in MVP, we have our core principles, but you were talking about mutually supportive across the watershed, and that seems like to be a whole other level of thinking, I would imagine, for municipal staff in particular who have been tasked with their boundaries. And so has there been, how has that process of building mutually supportive project selection within the watershed?
Well, one of the cool things that's been really lovely is there's a lot of both know-how, technology, lived experience, information sharing across boundaries. So it's a lot of the urban communities like Chelsea and Everett who are teaching their less urban neighbors about social vulnerability. So it's not just about wealth, it's about what's your core experience, what's your core capacity, but it's also different communities will have expertises that they're proud of, and so some of our smaller communities are really, really good at MacGyvering interns and technical support grants and doing a lot with less. And so they'll teach that to other communities as well. I want to give a shout out to Lexington as a community that does a lot of outstanding work with not a lot of resources. But the other thing that our colleague Carrie Hewlett, who's an outstanding facilitator, one of the questions she put to the group as we were forming is she asked, if we are wildly successful, what do you want to see happen for your community? And people wrote that down. And then another question was, if we are wildly successful, what do you want to see happen for our neighboring community? Name that community and tell us what you want to see happen for them. And that really just pulled out people's natural generosity and humanity and set the tone for how we work together. It's a tremendously collaborative group of folks. It's really, there's a recognition that, I'm going to be better off by being in this group. I'm going to get more out of this than I put into it, even if this particular project doesn't benefit me directly. Overall, I'm better off. And so right now it's Arlington, because it has more capacity, doing the supporting the MVP grant for Wicked Hot Mystic when they're not the hottest town. And it was Somerville who is doing the regional Lower Mystic MVP project, even though Somerville is barely in the Lower Mystic, but they care about the T and they care about Logan and they care about all the infrastructure. So that is just a sense of we're in it together. This is larger than any of us can pull off ourselves.
Great, thank you. There's a question from the chat asking about some specifics, I think regarding your first project in terms of if you expect that permitting will be achieved, and will DEP allow wetland impacts to expand the stormwater detention?
I think we don't expect to put stormwater into healthy wetlands, but rather like Woburn, there's a project where a wetland was filled to make a bowling alley. And so we'll put a wetland in an old bowling alley. And it's pretty amazing. When you look down on the ground, you can still see the black and white tiles. So by the time we get to the permitting level, we're going to really be causing net benefits for wetlands, not polluting existing wetlands with runoff. So,
Great.
it's fully our intention to be not dumping into healthy wetlands.
And can you say any more about the selection criteria for the 18 wetland sites, about how they were chosen?
Yeah, and I would also say that Emily Sullivan from Arlington could give you a lot more on this than I could. But basically the criteria were physically, where's the bedrock? What's the slope? So you might have this big honking area, but the bedrock is 3 inches down. It's not going to hold much water, or it's a brownfields, or it's on the side of a hill. It's not going to absorb much water. So basically, will it actually physically store water? improve the hydraulics so that it actually could contain surrounding floodwater. Second would be, does the landowner want this to happen? You know, so we could say like, hey, private school, we want to use all your athletic fields, but they're like, no, that's our athletic fields, you know, so maybe we could do something under your athletic fields, but does the landowner actually want to see this happen? A third was really around equity, and we had a course filter for equity in terms of, is this area near folks who we want to see additional social benefits, or is it going to solve a flooding issue that's affecting public housing, senior housing, schools? And then I think that's pretty much, I feel like there was a finer grain than that, but it's basically like, can we pull this off? Will it work? And what are the co-benefits?
Mm-hmm. Great. There, obviously your collaborative does a huge amount in terms of community engagement. There is a question that's from the chat specifically about how folks can get more involved. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that, and also some of what you feel like have been your most successful strategies that maybe other municipalities could learn from in thinking about doing regional projects in the future.
Great. If you are from the Mystic River watershed, even if you don't know you are, but you realize you are now that you've seen our map, you're welcome to join our working groups and work on the specific projects. If you are in another watershed and want to do something like ours, I would be thrilled to walk you through the nuts and bolts and put you in contact with some of our municipalities. I think I missed part of that question. What did I miss?
There was just a specific ask of how to get involved with your projects, but also maybe some of the broader lessons learned that other municipalities could incorporate in regional projects about engaging community.
Great. I guess I would answer that in two ways. One is about engaging municipalities, is that the first thing we did, where I said we launched in September 2018, but we really started in March 2018, is we went around and did one-on-one meetings with 50 people, predominantly municipal staff, but also other thought leaders in the Mystic, and really said, what do you want to accomplish first? And so the whole RMC was led by what municipalities were missing in terms of needs. I would do this exact same thing as I was working with community groups, is start from where people are at. And I think our normative way of doing community planning is to start with planners and engineers and bring the community in sort of 25% through, 75% through, and final. We really need to start with lived experience. And the Providence, Rhode Island, Oakland, California, there's a growing number of communities that are doing really, really great community-led or community-engaged climate planning. And what Providence says is, look, we ask people 4 questions. How do you stay cool in the summer? How do you stay warm in the winter? What's making you sick? And how do you get around? And so we're trying to actually solve people's challenges, and then to say, how can we solve your lived experience problems while we are investing in climate resilience, right? And so the co-benefits actually end up being incredibly important to people. It's not a good to have. It's makes this really meaningful immediately, not just when we have a climate event. So I would say it that way. I guess the other thing I would say is some of the best, we are learning from environmental justice organizations about doing incredible community engagement. And the best practice we're learning is to not have translators at public meetings, but have meetings in people's first languages, which seems like a duh, but it's a duh. Like, you have to be, just as we are willing to pay for engineering expertise, we need to be willing to pay for translators, food, childcare, gift cards to supermarkets, those things that pay people for their lived experience. And you know, it could be a standing community group of people who would never speak at a pub or even go to a public meeting. And therefore you're only getting the more resilient people like me willing to speak up. It's really saying, who are the folks who are most affected? How can I meet them where they're at, compensate them for their lived expertise, and do what I need to do for their comfort, not just my comfort. So there are some great best practices that we are learning from and trying to emulate.
Excellent. Thank you. That definitely weaves into some of the priorities that the MVP program has in terms of engagement and uplifting environmental justice communities. I'm wondering if, as a quick question before we move on, if you could just let us know what is your next hope for your project? What is your next vision of that, what you're hoping to achieve?
It's really my job as co-facilitator is to secure the resources we need for communities to move forward on these projects. So being 2.5 years in, we're closing in on the data we need for flooding, for infrastructure resilience, and for heat. And we're learning more in terms of the social resilience group about things like green gentrification. So once we lay down the data, we're really moving into projects, and that means funding for design and permitting and really major funding for capital projects. And so I feel like very much we are building and fueling the airplane as we are trying to take off. And so I believe that we have what it takes to be successful, but for the resources. And my hope is that in showing the need, we can help increase the resources across the state. You know, the municipalities are stepping up, but we can't do it as municipalities. And if Greater Boston can get this far, and we're probably the best resourced of our municipalities, smaller communities can't. So, you know, our next thing is really lobbying at the state and federal level, not just for the Mystic, but to increase the programs. So my hope is that other municipalities would like to work with us on lobbying the legislature to get MVP to 100 million a year or more and off the annual appropriation cycle, which we all hate, including you, I'm sure. So.
Well, thank you so much for that, Julie. We really appreciate the insights that you've had to offer, and I'm going to pass it back over to Andrew.
So yeah, that's outstanding. I can't thank you enough for your presentation. We really had a lot of good questions for folks from folks. I think one of the most important takeaways that we were able to kind of pull from all three of these today. Each of you mentioned the concept of a steering committee and making sure you have this process for accountability within the communities that you're working in. And one of the most important things that I really pulled from Julie's presentation was this notion of creating a perception of abundance when you're thinking about your neighboring communities instead of a perception of scarcity. And so it sounds like having this governance structure that allows you to get to the point where you're willing to think about your neighbors from a position of how can I help them. It sounds like Julie's work in Mystic has really had a lot of to benefit from creating that perception of abundance rather than scarcity. I think that my hope personally, and I can't speak for all the RCs, is that we see more communities working across boundaries and working across borders in ways that help lift up their watersheds and have these regional resilience strategies implemented and adopted. So it looks like I'm getting a lot of questions in the chat. There are no questions in the chat, and I think it is now officially time. What I can say is that we are going to send out an email to participants with more resources. There's going to be contact information for people who have participated, so you can ask questions of our panel. And we're going to have this recorded and up on YouTube so people can watch and learn from it. And really our goal is that this is just a starting point, and that you can take these lessons and apply them in your own regions, in your own communities, especially as we're moving into the upcoming funding cycles. So any other thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns from my coworkers and colleagues? Just excellent job, everybody. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing everybody again and next time we do this.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.